At the Nocturnus, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
As we move through our medical training, we change. We see things that we can't unsee. We learn things that we can't unlearn. And sometimes, our sense of humor comes into play in ways that don't quite feel kosher. I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnus, stories from the world of medicine. In our final episode of the season, medical student Jenny Tiskus shares 3 stories of death that shaped her identity as a budding doctor. After the story, we talk about her rural upbringing and how she developed the confidence to apply to medical school. Here I give you Jenny Tiskus.
I'm a first-year medical student, which means that of all the people in this room, I might be the least qualified to help you in an emergency, like if you were choking on a giant shrimp. I'm at the stage of my training where I'd probably stand back in a frenzy, diagnosing you with rare diseases, sweating heavily from my mustache area. I'm a beginner here, and I don't have anything to teach you, but I do have some questions to ask. I'd like to talk to you about 3 deaths that mattered to me and about laughing in the face of them, about gallows humor. And I'd like to ask your expert advice about how to keep my soft acreage intact. I want to know a little bit about what stands between the emotional land where I am now, where the deaths that I've witnessed have been deeply intimate and personal, and where you are now, where death is a part of your job. Which brings me to the first death. It was a stranger's fetal demise. I was shadowing a doctor, emphatically not at my home institution, categorically not someone that you know, and she called me up to a computer screen in her office and she said, hey Jenny, come look at this. And I should mention here that immediately prior to this, she had politely ignored it when I turned green and wobbled during the first ever C-section that I witnessed. Hey Jenny, come look at this. And on her computer screen, there was an image from an ultrasound, and it showed a severe fetal abnormality. I'm no expert, but even I could tell that what I saw was a sadness. "It's SpongeBob SquarePants," she chirped. And that was a cruelly accurate description of the figure on the screen. But later, she was a consummate and kind professional when she comforted that grief-stricken would-be mom. She held her hand. She was a good doctor. She had let me, just a whelp of a student, shadow her. She smiled at every newborn. She called every squishy simian little neonate beautiful, and she meant it. And so I didn't tell you the SpongeBob anecdote to vilify this doctor. In fact, I'm worried that I might turn out to be her. And I think that maybe the joke she told was the sort of thing that Sharon might say rowing across the River Styx, because some jobs just change you. Every dip of the oar and every death. And in fact, as a medical greenhorn, most of the deaths that I've seen have been very intimate, familial, personal. I took care of my badass cowgirl Grandma Phyllis as she died in rural Wyoming. There were no beds in the hospice. There were no beds in the nursing home, and it was a 5-hour drive to her oncologist appointments in Billings. I moved in with her as a 20-something woman with no medical experience and just tried to help as best I could. I slept on her couch, and I crept into her room at night to see if she was breathing, which she really hated. I sweat through my blouse as I drove her giant Dodge Ram pickup truck to the emergency room once when she had a torrential nosebleed that we both worried that she'd die from, with a hastily assembled pincher made out of popsicle sticks and a rubber band in order to stem the flow. Grandma Phyllis was dying of leukemia. And sometimes in my worst moments when I was exhausted and terrified and she was in pain and I didn't know how to help and she was getting worse and there wasn't care, in those times, sometimes I imagined driving her to that little ER and leaving her there with a note pinned to her jammies that said, "Will kick when bathed." But of course I didn't, because she was so great. In fact, the ER doctor gave her medical cocaine to stop that torrential nosebleed. And afterwards I joked, should I drive her to Studio 54? And without missing a beat, she looked me in the eye and said, "You crack me up, don't blow it." But even in this death of this woman who I loved so much, who was my sourdough pancake making, rattlesnake killing North Star, even then I was deeply imperfect, which is to say that I am a deeply imperfect prospective healer. And what will happen to me when death and illness become part of my work, in addition to stress and sleepless nights and trying not to hurt anybody and not having time to wash my hair and not having time to process the grief and human sadness that becomes a part of my day-to-day life. What will that leach from my bones? What will former big-eyed rural milkmaid Jenny, who used to cry at Olympics commercials, think of future dried-out emotional jerky Jenny? And actually, I think this process of emotional desiccation might have started already. So, like many a first-year medical student, I have dissected a dead human body. I know, for example, that in order to cut into skin, it takes very little pressure with a scalpel. It's almost like drawing a paintbrush across a page. I know that big nerves feel slippery, a bit like the cables that used to connect old-fashioned telephones to jacks in the wall. And once on a date, when I was asked, "What did you do today?" instead of answering, "I dissected a human face for 4 hours, and it was beautiful and satisfying to tease out different parts of the facial nerve, but a little bit upsetting to rub the yellow fat until it dissolved, revealing vasculature, and don't even get me started on those muscles of mastication," I said, "Oh, you know, school." And so I'm honored to be talking to you doctors and professionals here who spend the hours and days of your life dedicated to the service of healing others. And I think I'm beginning to understand that it is sacred, it is profound, and it appears to fuck you up. Which brings me to the third death, my dad. He died in our living room in a hospital bed when I was 13. And I called the funeral home to come pick up his body, and I shimmied him into a pair of suit pants before they came to pick him up early on that Easter Sunday morning. But the suit jacket was a little trickier. And the home health nurse aide had also come over, I think probably because my dad had been a regular at the dry cleaners where she used to work. So she helped me put his arms into the sleeves, and we locked eyes, and I said, "Medium starch," which was a reference both to his standing shirt order and impending rigor. And we both laughed. And even in this death that was so personal to me, of this man who was hard-nosed and soft-hearted and stoically provided for his girls in a small Montana town, but secretly loved musical theater and was kind of an undercover feminist from the experience of raising 2 daughters. Even then, not all my thoughts were poetic and grief-stricken. In fact, I remember thinking, maybe I won't have to go to school on Monday, and then feeling really selfish. And I also remember thinking, what if the Easter bunny, because it was Easter, had hopped up to our door with that basket full of goodies, taken one look at my dad's dead body and yellowing skin and said, "Oh, hell no," and hopped off to some normal house to hide eggs. I recently read an article where this doctor wrote that the difference between gallows humor and cruel humor is the difference between whistling as you go through the graveyard and kicking over headstones as you go along. And it is my honor to address you all today as I'm at the very beginning of this journey. And I think what I want to know and what I'm wondering is what this might take from me. So I'd like to ask your help, that if you could tell me, or whatever roughly equivalent unseasoned skillet passes your way, how you kept your humanity intact. Thank you.
Hi, Jenny. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good. I am sitting here with Jenny Tiskus. Jenny, would you like to tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what your work is?
Sure. I'm a second-year medical student at Stanford, so I'm at the very beginning of my training. I'm a newly minted 30-year-old, and so I think I came to medicine through a little bit of a non-traditional path. But now I'm back, and I'm studying very hard for finals tomorrow. And I also came here today. My car broke down. I rode my bike through the rain to make it through to a train, which I missed. And so I'm wearing Emily's borrowed scrubs because my clothes were soaked. So thanks for the loan.
You're welcome. Maybe first in the interview, I'd love to hear about growing up. Where are you from? What was your childhood like? I'd love to know.
Yeah, so I'm from Polson, Montana, which is a little town on the Salish and Kootenai Reservation in rural Montana.
Wow.
Yeah, it's dirt roads, red cows. It's a magical place.
And I remember you mentioned in your story about your dad dying and how much of an impact that had on you, and then specifically in the moment, finding somehow a moment of levity in that time of loss. How old were you when your father passed away, and how did his death impact you?
I think I was about 12. Yeah, I was 12. And it was a really world-rocking event for me. He had definitely been the pillar that held our family up, and his death sort of made everything chaotic. My sister immediately afterwards went to college, and it felt like our family in some ways dissolved. But he was also the first death that I had seen up close, the first dead body. And as I started my medical training, those memories were so close to the first dead bodies that I saw in a medical context. And that is a strange thing, to have something so personal be linked to your professional life, your work, your studies. But it also really profoundly changed my views about things like physician aid in dying. And, people are sometimes ready to go before they suffer greatly at the end of their lives. So he died at home in our living room with, palliative care, with hospice care, but it was wrenching and terrible.
Sounds like it had a really strong impact on you. Had you been thinking about going into medicine before your father died, or was that really the catalyst, or was it later when you were taking care of Grandma Phyllis, or how did the idea that you wanted to be a doctor weave its way into your story?
I think bodies have always been fascinating to me, and I did dissect a heart for the 5th grade talent show, which is horrible and embarrassing.
Oh my god! Wait, hold on. So you on stage in an auditorium dissecting a heart in front of your classmates?
Yes, a beef heart. Yeah.
Could they see, or was there like a screen projecting what you were doing?
It was pretty broad strokes. I held it up. I talked about it briefly, but definitely cemented my place as a giant nerd forever. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think I had always been really interested in bodies and the way that, people experience their lives through their bodies. But I never was sure that I would be smart enough or able to get into medical school. And so, honestly, I think my dad's death made me less sure that I could handle that. It seemed like medicine was unable to help him, and that it was really full of sadness and difficulty and, half measures that weren't really effective. And then when I went to Stanford, fresh from Polson, Montana, which was a wonderful place to grow up, I had an amazing, supportive, tiny high school, but I was a good decade behind in math and science. And so I remember standing in the back row of this intro to chemistry class at Stanford as a freshman, and I stayed in that room for 2 minutes before I left. Because it was the most people I think I'd ever been in a room with at one time. And from the first words the professor said, I didn't understand what was happening, so I left. And I was an arts major thereafter because I was afraid that I couldn't handle it. But when I took care of my Grandma Phyllis while she was dying of leukemia in rural Wyoming, I knew that I had to try, and it was
okay for it to be really hard or okay for me to be bad at it, but I knew that I needed for my own satisfaction to see if I could follow that path.
And when you were taking care of Grandma Phyllis, how old were you then?
That's, I think, like 25 or 26. Pretty recently, yeah.
Yeah, still fairly young to be having those kinds of serious caregiving responsibilities. I'm wondering, how did all of that responsibility fall on you, on your shoulders, as, you know, a young woman going through your 20s?
So I'd been working as a letterpress printmaker. I made fancy wedding invitations up into that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I moved in with her while she was really sick. She had moved into a little apartment closer to this tiny Band-Aid stop ER because she really needed help. And the nursing home was absolutely full. There were no open spots. And it's really far to the doctor there. Like, her oncologist was in Billings, and that's a 5-hour drive. So she needed someone to stay with her, and there really weren't other options. So unlike when, you know, my dad had been sick and there was some hospice care, there was some support in the community, in really rural Wyoming, those things just don't exist in the same way in a lot of places. And so I felt like I was making fancy wedding invitations while people I loved were in absolutely dire need of real help. And it made my life feel frivolous. But also, my grandma was this amazing character, and there were always people dropping in to visit her. So it was really important to her that she stay in her hometown because that's what she cared about while she was dying. And so I think I made 5 to 10 pots of coffee a day because people would just drop by. I was constantly baking because there needed to be snacks for the old timers that were telling stories. Yeah, and there were really hard times with her while she was dying. And absolutely, I mean, she was dignified and ferocious, and there were things that I think she didn't want me to see that I saw because I was caring for her. But really, my love for her and for that community of old timers made me feel like I needed to try medical school.
Mm-hmm. Did you move in with her?
I did. I slept on her couch.
How long were you with her?
Several months.
It's a long time.
Mm-hmm. A long time to be on a couch, yeah.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me about what you're talking about is just this world of living in a rural space. I've always lived in urban spaces. I grew up in Miami, Florida, which is like a sprawling metropolis. And as I've gone through my medical training, I've seen a lot of patients die surrounded by friends and family. I've seen a lot of patients, unfortunately, die alone. And I've been thinking a lot about the importance of community. And it's interesting to me that in this rural town, there was so much that wasn't there. You know, the oncologist was 5 hours away. The resources, the palliative care hospice hadn't really trickled into that space yet. But there was something else, which was, as you say, all the old timers coming by, making coffee, having snacks, telling stories. Did you feel that tension, that there was something there that needed to be there, and maybe the medical things weren't there, but perhaps if you were in a super compressed, urban, dense environment with all the medical resources, that maybe that sense of community wouldn't be there? And that tension between those two things?
Yeah, it's hard for me to know because I haven't spent as much time living in urban places. Even now I live in Palo Alto, which is its own special, weird suburban bubble. But people show up for each other in such a big way there. I think about her funeral, her girlfriends who were in this, I guess I would describe it as like a philanthropic cowgirl sorority called the Cowbells. Like, they brought all of the food and they served it, and everyone in the entire town came to the school for that funeral. And I think about when people get sick. Like, in my hometown, there are constantly pancake feeds and spaghetti feeds, and everyone goes. And if you can't afford it, then you just come in the door. But it's always raising money for someone who's sick or who's been in an accident or who needs extra help. So I don't think that's as common in big places. And that's a really beautiful, magical thing about that area, that people care for each other and they show up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the part in your story where you said taking care of Phyllis was something that gave you a lot of purpose and a lot of meaning, but it was also exhausting. And sometimes there were these moments where all you wanted was to drop her off at the emergency room with a note pinned to her jammies that said, "We'll kick when fed."
We'll kick when bathed.
We'll kick when bathed.
But both would apply.
And obviously that's tongue-in-cheek, but caregiver burnout is a very real thing, and I imagine something you probably experienced as you were a young woman in your 20s, sleeping on the couch for several months. So I'm wondering if that's something that you've thought about since then, or especially now as a medical student dealing with patients and their families. I know for me as a hospitalist, I do see families kind of drop off their elderly loved one at the hospital, and sometimes they're just like, gosh, we need a break. Mm-hmm. How do you think about that problem?
Yeah, I want to react with some compassion and some gentleness to those family members, because it can be really hard and it's a job that doesn't stop. And it's one of those funny tricks of being a human where the people you love the most are the people you can be the biggest shitbird to. Like, you know that you can give them a little bit more static and they'll accept it. And my grandma and I had an amazing relationship, and it was an experience full of really good things, but she was hard on me, definitely. As you would be if you lived in a one-bedroom apartment with someone while you were losing control of your life and your body, right? So my best friend in medical school went home to Texas to take care of her dad as he was dying this past year, and her mom is also chronically ill. And I checked in with her a lot to be like, is there anything bad you want to tell me that you feel like you can't say? Like
the confessions.
Yeah. Are you starting to laugh at things that are a little on the dark side? Like, do you need time for a pedicure? Because this is hard. And I think caregivers are not often able to take a break, especially in resource-poor situations. But it's a hard, big job.
And so then when did the decision really firm up? When did it become clear that, yes, Jenny, am going to apply to medical school and become a doctor?
I talked about it with my grandma. Wow. We sat at her table and we drank a million cups of coffee, and we talked about her life and the ways that she wished things had been different and the things she was most proud of. And we also talked about where I was and what I really needed to be doing. And I told her that it was, fear, that I couldn't hack it, that was holding me back. And she said, you're not better than anyone else, but I'll be goddamned if you're not just as good. And I started taking a little online math class while I was there. I'd go to get Wi-Fi at the McDonald's parking lot, which was like the big spot in town, and download a math lesson and take it back to her apartment.
And how was it? You said when you came to college you were a decade behind in science and math. Mm-hmm. Was it a big challenge to catch up, or did you find that actually it was, just a few courses and then you were where you needed to be?
I will say it's an ongoing challenge. I did my post-bac at Montana State in one searing lightning flash thunderclap of a year, like all my pre-medical requirements and my MCAT, while I had other wild things happening in my personal life, and it was very intense. But then I'm in Stanford Medical School, and it's the Thunderdome of science students. And I feel almost all the time really lucky that my peers are, like, I watch them learn. A concept will land on them for the first time, and they will learn it, and it's amazing. I feel grateful that people like that are solving problems and being doctors and researchers. But it does mean that I've had to work pretty hard to catch up. And I understand that people bring different things. I'm older, different life experience. I worked at Planned Parenthood for a while. All those things make me a different kind of student, and also comparison is the thief of joy, and that's not helping anyone. But I will say I've probably had to hustle a little bit more in the hard science classes to keep my head above water.
So the process of going into medicine for you then was a very active one. It was sort of fraught, it sounds like. There was a lot that was maybe dug up about your past and your education. Did you have any time or space as you were transitioning into medical school to even consider the possibility that the career might cause, as you describe, an emotional desiccation, which I think is such a vivid term for what happens to us as we go through this process? Were you thinking about that in advance as well?
I thought about it a lot, and I think I worried that the workload and the constant time stress and the pressurized way that you experience people's best and worst days, that those things could be really wearing over time. And I think like all people, I've had good and bad experiences with doctors, but I've had a few experiences where I've seen doctors on not their best day. And I do worry that through this process that I can lose some of the things that I'm most proud of about my own character. And I do worry that it might be bad for me to live on Stanford campus. I feel like a real housewife of Stanford Medical School. The other day I ordered oat milk in my coffee with total confidence. I'm worried that living this way, like on this resort-like beautiful place with this patient population that's so different than the people that I hope I eventually serve, I worry that that could change me in ways that I don't want to change either.
One thing that I loved about your story was the way that you framed it. So you started the story by saying, I'm a medical student, I really don't know anything, I'm still learning. And throughout the entire story, you're addressing the room, this room of doctors, and I think you say of professionals who are, a few strokes of the oar ahead of you. And you end your story with a question, and you say, can you help me figure out how to hold on to my humanity as I move through this process? So I'm curious to know, did you get a response?
I did get a few responses. An audience member who was an elderly man came up to me and said, and embraced me, hugged me, and said, you need to remember to love people, which I think is good advice. But he so clearly had been successful in doing this because he, seemed like he might be near retirement age, and was giving me this very simple, very loving advice in such a sincere way. I don't think anyone else gave me a direct answer to that question, but if you have one, I would love to know.
I don't know, maybe I'll invite our listeners. If you have an answer, send it to us, because I would certainly love to know what thoughts there are out there about how to walk this fine line. This comes up a lot in these interviews, this theme and this question just of how do you function as a professional who is operating in this realm of darkness, really. And there is joy and there is light, but really there is a lot of suffering and darkness. And so how do you sustain that? And so I welcome any answers from our listeners.
I've been thinking about who you should talk to about it as well. There are some stories you can't tell other people because you need to keep someone's privacy. And in that way, it might be more appropriate to discuss that with another physician in training and leave out their details. But I also wonder if there are relationships that you shouldn't be filling with these stories of sadness and these struggles. But if you don't, are you cutting off your intimacy with someone? Still working on that.
That's a really good question, which actually reminds me of the part of your story where you talk about dating. My husband is outside of medicine, and I think he actually had some secondary trauma just hearing about the things that I was going through. I think it is an interesting question. Like those stories and those feelings and that sadness, it is so intense. And so is that more appropriate for a professional therapeutic relationship, like going to see a therapist, which I think, by the way, we all should be doing. I think I saw a headline for an article a year or two ago that was like, welcome to medical school, find a therapist, like first step.
Agreed. Part of my story that I omitted before was that I was married at 22 and was married, all through my 20s, and then ultimately got divorced right before medical school. And those things never happen for simple, it's always a constellation of factors, I think. But my partner just didn't want to be ground up in the training. And so pretty explicitly, medical school is a big part of why I'm not married anymore. So I think I am sensitive to that this makes big changes in your personal life. Absolutely.
One of my best friends in medical school, similarly, right before starting school, had split up from a partner. The partner just didn't want anything to do with it. That's hard.
Yeah.
But I think it goes back to caring for the caregiver, too. It's not just how do we support people who are caring for a sick loved one, but how do we support the physician who's caring for the sick patient? And then how do we support the partner of the physician who, it's so all interconnected. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on this concept of gallows humor, because I think one way to deal with all of this is to laugh. And part of what your story was asking was, when is it okay to laugh? When is it disrespectful versus therapeutic and appropriate?
I think all of us intuitively know, or most of us intuitively know, if we're hurting people. I think it would be really hard to share comedy with a patient. I think it's possible, but I've seen it go wrong so many times. I'm not saying that I've tried it. I'm at the stage where I very politely and nervously adjust my stethoscope very gingerly on your chest. It's made me think about the two parties and the power dynamic, and when someone's in a more vulnerable place, if that humor in some way preys upon them to give me emotional release when they're the person who primarily needs care. So that relationship of who is caring for who is really important to me to maintain.
And specifically, you're referring to doctor and patient interacting in a room, and doctor cracks a joke and it just doesn't quite land.
Right. Does that happen a lot? Do you see that?
To be honest, I find that when those little jokes are sprinkled in, that usually they work.
Maybe it depends on the doctor.
Maybe it depends. I do know that I was taking care of a man with a pretty serious brain injury who had been not well for a couple decades, actually, but he had this incredible mother who took care of him. She was actually a nurse, and she was almost 90 years old, and she was his caretaker. And he was sick in the hospital, and we weren't sure if he was going to make it through the night. And she came in, and we sat down and just kind of had a chat about what we thought was best for her son. And I can't remember if someone cracked a joke or how it happened, but at some point during that conversation, it was like 6:30 p.m. on like a Wednesday night, there was this moment where we both just started laughing. It might have been, she spoke Spanish, and my Spanish is not great, but it was this really nice moment of laughter in the middle of this really serious discussion. And my interaction with that lady ended with this really nice hug and kiss, and I think she said something like, oh, you're so cute, I love you, or something like that. It's just like the most delightful lady, and so I think it is possible. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for sitting down to talk with me, and I think you're just going to be amazing, and let me know if you discover the secret of how to hold it all together as we go through.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for making this space.
That was the wonderful Jenny Tiskus. And that's it. That's season 2 of our show. I can't believe it's already over. A few announcements before the end of the show. First, for any medical students listening, I want to recommend a couple of podcasts for you. One of them is called the Short Coat Podcast, and the other is called the Undifferentiated Medical Student Podcast, and both of them are really fabulous for medical students to listen to, so check them out. I also want to express extreme thanks and gratitude to everyone at the Nocturnist team for making this season possible. Some of us are actually doctors who practice medicine, and other people on the team have full-time jobs, so this is really a labor of love that we do in our free time, and I'm really proud of how far we've come. I just want to thank everybody for listening, for sharing, for spreading the word, for sending me lovely emails about how these stories have impacted you. It's just been so incredible to see how this community of storytellers and listeners and people who are passionate about narratives and medicine is continuing to grow. I want to give extra thank yous to executive producer Allie Block, podcast producer Marina Poole, program coordinator and head of story development Adelaide Papazolo, our sound engineer Alberto Hernandez, assistant producer Kirk Lucky, our podcast intern Chloe Lassard, our social media manager B. Logan, our illustrator Lindsay Mound, our composer Yessie Monroe, the voice of Boaz Monroe, and our fundraising lead Cecilia Peterson. This episode's story was coached by Melissa Brandt. And last but not least, thanks to our storyteller, Jenny Tiskus. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. We are the Nocturnists. Good night.